In our last video, we looked at the area just south of the Blue Water Bridge, and we want to continue looking at that area. Before we do, something was brought to my attention this week, an old postcard I found of the Shanties that people used to fish off of. They were from just north of the Pine Grove Park, probably almost all the way to Peerless Mint. And these were just rickety old shacks built with any kind of lumber they could find. Not very safe at all, but it gave the fishermen ways to get out a little ways from the shore, and it was good fishing off of there. But I never played on them. A lot of folks I know did. But I did go swimming near those shanties. In our last video, I told you that this is the view that my generation had looking north from Pine Grove Park. We saw the big oil tanks and Peerless Mint. The generation before mine would have been looking at this view, a completely different view. This view includes the Botsford grain elevator that was so prominent in this picture. This was the grain elevator that they had at the railroad site. It was conveniently located so that the railroad could have access to it, and also the waterways, the shipping could go from that elevator. Here's a rare photo of the Pine Grove Park and also the Botsford elevator from a brochure of about 1900. But you can see Pine Grove Park actually looks like it has a roadway going all the way through there. And it's a really good view of the Botsford grain elevator as well. There were three major grain elevators in Port Huron at the time. The McMorran, the Grand Trunk elevator, and the Botsford. Botsford was actually two elevators side by side. Here it's listed as A and B. Unfortunately, in November 1901, both these grain elevators were destroyed. The newspaper article had this paragraph in it as well. The steamer Spokane from Chicago was unloading grain when the fire started. It was only saved by heroic efforts of her crew. One residence nearby was also burnt, and so like so many wooden structures in that time period, it was destroyed by fire. Also, the McMorran elevator was destroyed by fire also, but we'll look at that in another video. But before the condos and before the Peerless Men and the oil tanks, there was a Grand Trunk rail yard there. 1859 was an important year for Port Huron. Under the name of Chicago, Detroit, and Canada Grand Trunk Junction Railway, a 57-mile track was completed that connected Port Huron to Detroit. And even more important, a car ferry was introduced that eliminated the need to unload and reload cargo, as the new ferry could transport the railway cars themselves across the river. The first ferry they used at this location was called a swing ferry. The swing ferry was very similar to what they were using to transport their horse and buggies across the rivers or lakes, wherever they might be. The swing ferry was anchored by a chain of about 1,000 feet near the American shore, and depending on her angle was driven by the current in the rapids from one shore to the other. Her slips were at Point Edward above Sarnia and at Fort Gratiot in Port Huron, almost exactly at the piers of the first Blue Water Bridge. Of course, these ferries would have to be much larger in order to be able to take those railroad cars on board. The swing ferry had a point of such heavy traffic as the rapids presented a menace to navigation. In about 1867, she collided with an upbound steamer, severing her chain and drifting uncontrolled down the river. The schooner Reindeer picked her up off of Butler Street in Port Huron. The swing ferry was retired by Grand Trunk, and the hull was converted into the Wolverine dry dock as pictured here. The ferry that replaced the swing ferry was the first propeller-driven ferry in the Great Lakes. It had been built specifically for the Point Edward Fort Gratiot ferry run. The name of this ferry was International 2. International 1 worked the ferry route on the Niagara River. And of course, Point Edward and Fort Gratiot had to enlarge their slips to accommodate her. Some 300 to 400 cars were customarily ferried per day in the early years, and she did it on only 2 cords of wood, which is pretty economical. This picture gives you an idea of what this type of ferry looked like from above. Grand Trunk's traffic grew greatly in the 1870s. By the mid-1870s, International was no longer able to handle the traffic going across the river. And so the railway ordered a similar but somewhat larger ferry, the Huron, which is pictured here. Rail traffic continued to increase and Grand Trunk continued to prosper. In 1882, the company built car and locomotive shops in a roundhouse in Fort Gratiot's Village Block 1. This would have been just north of the Blue Water Bridges, about where Dunn Paper Mill is. The new machine and locomotive shops witnessed the very first electric lights in the city. Vestibued passenger cars were built in these shops from 1890 to 1899. The prosperity brought to Fort Huron by Grand Trunk was interrupted by the November 1913 disaster that assaulted the car shops. On November 9th, the shops suffered extensive damage from the storm that ravaged the Great Lakes. And then on November 26th, it saw the final destruction as fires swept through the 10 acres of buildings. The car shops were eventually rebuilt. The new car shops, which opened in 1918, were relocated to 35 acres in the vicinity of the Fort Huron approach to the St. Clair Tunnel. And this is where most of my generation remember the Grand Trunk rail yards being. So where did Fort Gratiot get its name? Well, before the condos and before Peerless Men and before the rail yards, there was a fort here. And the name of the fort? You guessed it, Fort Gratiot. This military outpost of Fort Gratiot was established in 1814. It did very little to attract pioneers as the area selected was already inhabited. The permanence of the fort and its inhabitants was questionable as it was abandoned in 1822. It was lent as a mission to Christianize and educate Native Americans in 1823. It was in ruins by 1826. It was rebuilt in 1829, only then to be abandoned once again in 1837. This military installation may not have brought prosperity, but it did assist in developing Fort Huron. The fort was the reason a military road was built between Fort Gratiot and Detroit. The United States Congress authorized the building of this military road on March 2, 1827, and construction began 3 months later and was completed in 1833. This road, which was then called Gratiot Turnpike, of course is still used today. Of course, it's not referred to as a turnpike. Eventually, a settlement did develop outside the military fort that was organized as the village of Fort Gratiot in 1838. This was the entrance to the fort. On the inside, it was known as Residence Square. The fort was named in honor of this man here, Charles Gratiot. He was the engineer that oversaw the rebuilding of the fort. And I say rebuilding because in the 1600s there was a Fort Joseph there, or very near there. Anyway, Fort Gratiot encompassed that particular fort, what was left of it. And so they say it's rebuilt, but basically he had to start pretty much from scratch. All right, before we leave this area, just look at one more thing. Thomas Edison's home, some controversy about this. This postcard that was in our collection supposedly shows the boyhood home of Thomas Edison, but in fact that's not true. This home was actually the home of his father in the last 30 years of his life, and it was over on Forest Street near Ballantyne. There was never a photo of his home. It was located on the southeast corner of the military outpost, and it faced north, so I had a wonderful view of the lake, Blue Water Bridge area, without the bridge, of course. But there is a wonderful sketch of the house that was sketched by a friend of the Edisons, and in this you can see it was a nice home, a large home, roughly 3,000 square feet. And also, there in the background, you can see the observation tower that Edison had built. In this bird's eye map of 1867, you can see here the observation tower quite plainly illustrated. And right alongside of it, right next to it, is Edison's home, right in that clump of trees there. So where would that be today? On the satellite view from Google, you can see all the condos there in a row. And then there's a gap right there. And that's where Edison's home would have been. We certainly can't go on from this area without looking at one of the landmarks of Port Huron, and that's the Blue Water Bridge, or as it is today, Blue Water Bridge is. Before it was bridges, it was bridge, and before it was bridge, it was the rapids, as you can see here. In 1927, people began thinking seriously about a bridge in Port Huron going to Canada. But then the Depression came along and the idea was shelved for a while. The construction started on the bridge on June 24th, 1937, and the bridge was completed and formally opened in 1938. So I wonder these crane operators didn't just keel over from the smoke that came from the ships that passed underneath. Here are some unique photos from the Canadian side. From the top of the bridge, you can see peerless men in the background. It has to be a little scary working up there. If you look closely there to your left, you can see the lighthouse. The present bridge wasn't the only design they considered. Here's a very unique looking design. I'm sure glad they didn't take it, because if you look at the entrance ramp, it looks like they have to have a stop sign and then turn right to get on the bridge. That's going to be a disaster for traffic flow. Here we have the dedication of the bridge, and there was the mayor of Port Huron and mayor of Sarnia, senator too, head of the bridge commission, and a bunch of people as well. These first two pictures was during the construction of the bridge, the entrance ramps. My dad took these photos. The other pictures following the next five here, these are on the bridge and after the bridge opened. As you can see here, it must have been a pretty exciting time for them to go across that bridge for the first time. I wonder if they were thinking, will this bridge hold all these cars? This says approach to the Blue Water Bridge, but actually this was the exit. The approach off Pine Grove was right here. This looked like it was maybe taken in the 60s or 70s, a bunch of bikers going on the approach. Probably no one realizes the significance of being able to go across a bridge when we've always had bridges, but prior to this, the only way we could get to Canada was by ferry. So this must have been pretty amazing at the time, and I'm sure they all were clamoring to be one of the first ones on the bridge. Notice that there are sidewalks on this bridge, and it's only a two-lane bridge. Later the sidewalks were taken out in order to make the third lane in the middle. But I remember walking across that bridge with my dad, and we never even stopped for customs. We just walked right across and walked right on back. Here are some postcards from my collection. My dad actually collected these, probably back in the 50s or so, and I told him, I said, Dad, why do you want to collect these? These are current photos. And he said, well, someday they won't be. And you know, he was right. They're no longer current. This is a bridge that I remember growing up. I couldn't think of the Blue Water Bridge without peerless men. They just went together. Construction started on the new bridge in 1995, and it was open in 1997. Do you think the folks that lived back in this period of time could imagine something like this? I mean, it would be right up among the impossible things like going to the moon. In our next video, we'll continue north and start with Lighthouse Park.